Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this on-fifth session on the first 100 days of the Biden administration and its implications for Asia. We're bringing this to you in association with our friends and partners at Barclays, who we thank for their continued support of on-fifth and the on-fifth network. The first 100 days of the administration in the US have been a big thing since the days of Franklin Roosevelt. You'll remember, of course, that he came in on the back of the biggest economic shock of all time, certainly of that century, and tried to hit the ground running with, I think, more than a dozen different bills passed in his first 100 days. And people have looked at the first 100 days of an administration as a benchmark ever since. And it certainly feels that Joe Biden has not only hit the ground running, but it feels like he's making up for lost time as well. I wonder whether that's because it's more than 30 years since he first tried to become president, whether he's trying to achieve as much as he can while he has the benefit of a majority in both houses, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's to row back on some of the things that happened under the Trump administration, or whether it's just the fact that he is at 78 years old, possibly a one-term only president. Maybe a combination of all those reasons. But he's certainly hit the ground running on day one, signing back up to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And now, after recent days, he's now committed to $6 trillion of spending commitments. And I think in these times of COVID pandemic, we get a little bit blasé about numbers, but it's worth just considering that $6 trillion of spending commitments across infrastructure, across jobs, across families, across the US economy, which will undoubtedly have a major impact on the world and on Asia as well. Although I referenced Roosevelt just now, it looks a little bit like the Eisenhower administration, the way that they dealt with the 1950s post-Second World War boom, which cemented America's place as the undoubted economic leader of the world. Now we wonder about whether there will be boom or bust, whether there will be inflation or sustainable growth. Whichever way you look at it, what happens in America will certainly impact the rest of the world. What's different to the 1950s, of course, is the balance of economic power and the shift to Asia. You have two centers of economic power now. You have the US and Asia, with Europe somewhere in the middle. And that is something that we're going to discuss today, I'm sure. Worth remembering as well that Biden, talking to Congress a couple of days ago, said, and I'm quoting here, "We can't stop now. We're in a competition with China and the rest of the world to win the 21st century." And these comments frame well what we're here to discuss today. We have a stellar group to discuss the fiscal and economic policies of Biden on climate change and the role of technology. And that's all going to be through the lens of what it means for Asia. And though it's easy to frame that conversation now as US-China, I'm sure we'll rightly speak about the broader region today as well. Just a quick run through on how today is going to work. We will have a keynote speech very shortly, and then 3 fireside chats where we have 2 experts who will debate each other and discuss the issues in their area of expertise. There is a Q&A function on Zoom, which you'll probably all be familiar with. Do please submit your questions. We will try to bring those questions to each group of panelists at the end of their 50-minute fireside chat. We'll also have a chance to put questions to all the panelists at the end of our session today. In total, the session will last for around an hour and a half. Do please ask your questions when you have them. We'll make sure they get to the panelists. And also do please make sure that unless you're a speaker, your microphone is on mute. So let's get going. And our first speaker, for our keynote speaker, we're delighted to have Dr. Tan Sri Munir Majid, who is currently chairman of CARI ASEAN Research and Advocacy, of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council Malaysia, and as well president of the ASEAN Business Club. He also sits on the board of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies Malaysia, and is board chairman of the Institute for Capital Market Research Malaysia. And he's an active advocate of deeper ASEAN economic integration. So Dr. Munir, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I think we're talking about Biden's first 100 days, but I would say at the outset, forget about the first 100 days. Indeed, I think for his whole presidency, the problem that Biden will face is that there is no return to the status quo ante. Now, it's not just about President Trump's disastrous failures, but goes back to mistakes and neglect of many previous administrations. Means from the start of the epochal end of history, which seems a long time ago, the last 30 years have been informed more by a post-American world. The question today is whether America is number one, whether the American political system is number one, whether the American economy is number one, whether American leadership and management is number one, and even whether American technology is number one. Now, the rise of China certainly has got something to do with this, but there has also been American decline since 9/11 and since the Western financial crisis of 2008. And of course, America's huge hand in the systemic mismanagement of that failure, and which exposed double standards in trying to address it. I'm skipping a fair bit of foreign and domestic policy failures, such as the pivot to East Asia that was not, decrepit US infrastructure, a massively divided society, to come to today. I'm jumping past all those. COVID deaths and mismanagement of the crisis, withdrawal from TPP. So President Biden has to connect domestic recovery to external strength again. So, of course, his speech to Congress last Wednesday addresses this to some extent, but I think he has to show that external strength ahead of that domestic recovery. And this is a problem, because he can only probe at the deficits which I have mentioned for, of course, the domestic audience. He has to probe it for PR reasons. American people have got to get the impression that there is a turnaround that has happened or is happening. Of course, he has had some good hits. I mean, the vaccination campaign has been outstanding after the failures of managing the COVID virus. Europe and the Atlantic Alliance have responded positively after having been blackballed by Trump. Also, the Quad has come along after visits to Japan and discussions with Japan, China, Australia on the Quad. But if we look back at some of the high points and low points of these 100 days, I would say Alaska was an overreach, which was cut down, and it actually reflected this problem about wanting to return to the status quo ante in a desperate hurry when you're not quite ready and when you have not even done your domestic recovery. So Alaska, I would say, was in a way an overreach, which was cut down. But on the other hand, climate change was good. It was good to take a leadership position. And this, I would contend, is the sort of leadership Biden should have started with. The functional approach. And it is an existential issue, of course, climate change, but it is still a functional matter. He has to build the credits and regain credibility before going for the geopolitical big hits and human rights issues. Now, even climate change is being watched. Of course, we know how Obama got into the Paris Agreement and Trump dumped it, how Clinton went with Kyoto and the Senate blocked it. So there's a lot of rebuilding to be done. And the best is to start with the functional approach. It is in the area of the economy that Biden has most work to do, both at home and abroad. I mean, he has to do what China has been doing. And there are many things that China has been doing in the meanwhile that the US has put the US on the back foot in terms of the economy, the regional economy. We know the RCEP has been signed, was signed last November, and we know that it's about to come into effect 60 days after 3 of the non-ASEAN members signed and 6 of the ASEAN members signed, ratify, and China has already ratified pretty swiftly. Japan just did recently. Singapore, Vietnam are moving pretty fast. So this thing is going to 1/3 of the world economy, 1/3 of the world population, 1/3 of the world trade. You can't be out of it in one way or another. You have to engage with RCEP. Even CPTPP is being talked about in China, and they want to become a member of CPTPP. Of course, the UK is coming in. And so you're having things happening in East Asia, in the economic field, in terms of regional integration that will integrate the supply chains within the region, that will actually encourage greater trade with the new rules of origin, that will encourage greater trade with, of course, at the start, small, but it will grow in the next 10 to 20 years, tariffs in the region. And Japan is very bullish about RCEP and is talked about RCEP adding 2.7% to its GDP, 570,000 jobs, new jobs as a result of it. These things are happening in this region, and I think the Americans cannot continue to be out of it. US has actually been withdrawing from the international economy and free trade agreements. Globalization is seen as bad domestically, when it is the restructuring of the US economy, not imports, that caused job losses. For all the talk of Chinese imports, they only cost the US about 2 million jobs out of a workforce of 150 million. The benefits of globalization has been unequal in the US internally. That's what needs to be addressed, and Biden is doing it, but it's going to take time to address inequality from which springs most of US nativism. Yet, despite all this, the US investment in APAC, the Asia Pacific, remains strong. Its investment in ASEAN has been growing at about 10% per annum in the past decade and totals 329 billion. And this investment is more than its investments in China, India, Japan, and Korea combined. And having said that, 1/3 of US investment abroad is in Indo-Pacific. Yet China lurks large. The US must find a strategic geo-economic underpinning in this region, my region, again, as China has done. Now, this does not mean undermining China, but it does mean engaging better than China, showing contribution better than China implicitly without having to make an issue with China in getting involved in this region again. So the US as I said, has to come back. The US, as Biden said, is back. But as Biden also said, for how long? And the US has to connect its domestic recovery to its external strength. How long would that take? And how much support is at home for what the US needs to do abroad and to work fast in this region? Because even as the US tries to recover at home, this region is not standing still. And so America must begin to make and take initiatives of re-engagement. Thank you very much for your patience listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Munir. That was a great way for us to start. What an interesting way to consider the discussions we're going to have later on today. I was very taken with your comment about domestic recovery through external strength. I'm sure that's something that we can talk about, and the need to embrace globalization again among the US administration, and to see the benefits of globalization. That leads rather nicely into our first fireside chat. And that involves two people very well placed to comment on how President Biden's plans will impact both the US economy and Asia's economic outlook as well. We are delighted to be joined by Jeffrey Baker, who's a 20-year US Treasury Department veteran, currently serving as the Treasury representative to Southeast Asia and based in Singapore. Before his assignment in Singapore, Jeffrey served as the director of the Office of Investment, Energy and Infrastructure at the US Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. So I'm sure can speak about the Biden infrastructure plans as well. He's also joined next to our virtual fireside this morning by Sean Golhar from our partner for today, Barclays. Sean is a managing director and head of public policy research at Barclays. He analyzes and publishes commentaries on major public policy issues, as well as advises the firm's global institutional investor and corporate client base. So very warm welcome to you both. My task here is to get the ball rolling and sit back and watch along with our audience. So here's a very leading question to get you going. The Biden administration's proposed spending plans that are unheard of in modern times. While they're clearly designed to boost the US economy after the pandemic, what impact will they have on the global economy and in particular Asia? I think it's only fair to let our Treasury representative go first on this. So Jeffrey, over to you and then to Sean.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, and I'm very happy to participate with Sean. Yeah, I think the keynote speaker, I would totally agree about the linkage between recovery at home and strength externally. And I think that's very much how the administration sees the challenge and how it is organizing its response to both the health crisis and the resulting recession. I think one of the overarching themes is we need to get our domestic house in order if we are then to expect to lead the global recovery and a global response to the pandemic. And I think the keynote speaker was also right in that the administration is very keen on this. Isn't just about returning to life as it was before the pandemic. It's very much about building back better and creating a prosperous economy for all. Again, I think very much addressing what the keynote speaker said about the domestic inequality that has developed in the United States, and the administration's policy is very focused on addressing that. And just maybe to hit some of the highlights, again, the first order of business is again arresting the health crisis, and I'm glad to see there is recognition that the vaccination effort in the United States is going well. I think it's almost 240 million shots have been delivered in the United States. The Biden administration had set the goal at 200 million in the first 100 days. They easily exceeded that. That's almost, that's about well over 55% of the adult population. And I think about close to 40% of the adult population in the United States is now what they consider fully vaccinated. So good progress. there. But I do want to flag that the administration is also actively supporting vaccinations abroad. The administration made a $4 billion commitment to the WHO COVAX facility, which I think is the single largest country contribution to that facility. We're also the largest shareholder in the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And I mentioned for the Asia Pacific reason, those are the two multilateral development banks that are relevant. ADB has a $6 billion vaccine support facility. The World Bank has a $12 billion vaccine facility. And then, of course, the administration's also looking at other possibilities to cooperate with partners. Probably seen the news about the recent aid to India, but clearly focused on supporting those efforts internationally. And then, as you said, addressing the economic crisis that results from the pandemic. We have the 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. And you're right, it's the largest relief package in the United States since the Great Depression. I think, as the keynote speaker again, I think got correct, I think they are trying to harvest lessons that have been learned, particularly from the response to the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And two things we keep hearing is that the administration thinks the risks are of doing too little and not too much. And then the other key lesson from the crisis was not withdrawing fiscal support too early. And in terms of how this benefits the rest of the world, I think the OECD has estimated that the ARA will boost US growth by about 3 to 4 percentage points, and global growth by 1 percentage point, which is actually quite substantial benefits for the rest of the global economy. Secretary Yellen has said that she hopes that the ARA will help the US hit full employment as early as next year. And I believe US GDP is expected to surpass pre-pandemic or return to pre-pandemic levels by the second half of this year. And then just really quickly, again, the Build Back Better piece, as you know, is the infrastructure plan, or what the administration calls the American Jobs Plan. And that is focused on, again, addressing the, I guess, quote unquote, decrepit infrastructure the keynote speaker mentioned. Again, a once in a generation investment in US infrastructure. And then that is being complemented by a significant tax reform that has both, I think, obviously domestic, but also international implications. And then I think the last piece that's really important, and again would agree about the U.S. Restoring the mantle of global leadership is leading on the issue of climate change. And again, that's probably one of the biggest changes I've seen with this administration, particularly at the Treasury Department. Just how central climate change is becoming. It's not just sort of one of the things that we do, it's becoming sort of incorporated as a theme in everything we do. And something Secretary Yellen is quite focused on. Treasury is very active both in sort of its role in domestic and international sort of financial supervisory forums and bodies in terms of assessing, managing and mitigating, climate risk, in the context of financial institutions. But the administration is also quite active in supporting, climate finance, has committed $1.25 billion to the Green Climate Fund to make good on the $2 billion pledge made during the Obama administration. Another $485 million to other multilateral climate initiatives. And then also expecting to make additional contributions to those initiatives and facilities in the future. So again, very domestic focus, but at the same time, I think everything they do also has very much an international aspect as well. But I'll leave it there for right now.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Jeffrey had said. I think from our point of view at Barclays, and again, I sit on the research side of the investment bank, the central issues has been this sort of fiscal expansion. Obviously the American Rescue Plan, which Jeffrey commented on, widespread support we saw. It's very rare that a president essentially formulates the policy in the transition, unveils on Inauguration Day, and it's passed within 50 days. And going back to Clive's opening remarks and comparisons to FDR, you don't see that very often in the US. The Democratic Party was together on that issue. They saw this as a need. Importantly, I think in terms of getting this over the hump and getting it passed, you saw public opinion polling quite high on that deal. We do think that the economic output on that has been quite positive. I think our current forecast right now, I want to say it's like 6%, or 6.8% for 2021, year over year, calendar year rather, GDP growth. You're seeing quite a bit of an expansion now in the US. This pivot now to American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan that President Biden and the administration has outlined, again, $4.5 trillion in spending over some 8 years, some tax increases on both corporates and individuals over 15 years. And we've published a little bit about this at the research side. It's too early to have like a firm baseline in terms of how we think some of this will play out. There's just way too many possibilities. But if anything, it appears to us that the administration's pitching this as what we'd call like a conventional or traditional infrastructure package with surface transportation, infrastructure, utilities, expanded a bit with broadband internet and wastewater and water. And then with, as the president talks, this human infrastructure. It's not so clear to us right now, how this will play out. There's a handful of scenarios that we've talked about and in the research side that we've published on. But I think what's key on a lot of this is, as the president has said, it's a view towards Asia. I think the first paragraph in the American Jobs Plan fact sheet from the White House has literally this quote that the US needs to outcompete China. And I think in the US, there is a bipartisan agreement that China poses the greatest risk, and the US really needs to figure out what the next steps will be. So you're seeing Congress work through a handful of bits of legislation on innovation and research and development. You're seeing this administration go forward on what would be or what could be a fairly monumental piece of legislation that would, in our view, reshape domestic and fiscal policy in the United States if it were passed as is. And a lot of this is in the context of a rising China and concerns in the US that, that Beijing wants to surpass the United States. President Biden talked a lot about that in his speech to Congress. You've seen members of Congress talk about this quite a bit. And that is something that isn't lost on it from our point of view. We see right now, and again, GDP growth obviously expanding as basically everybody on the street is seeing. We have 6.8% for 21, a tad under 4% for 22. We do see unemployment obviously shifting down. The big debate on inflation, we do not see this, quote unquote, once in a lifetime inflation coming back into play. We do think it does get gets a tad higher. And importantly, I think for this audience right now, in terms of US-China, and U.S.-Asia relations, we definitely, as probably the administration has said now over and over, but something that we've published quite a bit about for quite some time, the tariffs aren't going away. There's almost no reason to see that. But if anything, we're in this new paradigm of U.S.-China trade. I think we're in a more conventional approach in that, the administration will go back to the, deputies working through issues. It'll percolate through to the heads and these sort of chapter negotiation processes. I do think, and we do think at Barclays, issues of ESG, as we say in the US, environmental, climate-related issues, human rights-related issues, things that haven't always come up into play may actually come into play as they think about trade now. And you're seeing that both throughout the US government. And Jeffrey commented on the climate aspect in Treasury, but if you read through like the USTR, the US Trade Representative, and other reports that are coming out, you're seeing references to ESG topics that we haven't seen before. So I think the US is really turning a page on this. And that relationship is probably going to drastically change, or at least change incrementally over time. That will look at the end to be quite a bit of difference from where we were before. One last thing is that the president and the administration might unveil this $4.5 trillion worth of spending and this idea on how to reshape the U.S. fiscal and domestic policy situation, but it's up to Congress to get this done. And I think something that some of our foreign clients ask a lot about is, right now, Democrats have a very slim majority in the Senate and the House, 50-50 in the Senate, and literally it's only a few seats their majority in the House. To get a deal like this done will require a tremendous amount of negotiation and political skill, but you're also going to have to balance a lot of competing interests. And I think it is early to assume that a deal will happen or not happen, based upon some of these issues we see coming out. From the market's perspective, we're noticing from clients as well this sort of cautious wait and see approach. A lot of corporates and institutional investors that are nervous about the tax situation and the changes at play, but there's so many variables right now, between higher statutory corporate taxes to how do we feel about base erosion and profit shifting, this global minimum tax negotiation with the OECD. It's almost that there are so many variables at play. It's unclear, what the regime will look like come late summer or early fall. So I think a lot of folks on the institutional and corporate side are taking a more wait and see approach. There's a handful of other issues I can talk about, but I want to just pause there, as I know we're going to have a robust discussion with questions. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Clive.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jeffrey. I think it's very, very interesting. And the question of the US needs to outperform China, I think it's worth remembering that we've had 40 years where it doesn't really matter whether you have Republican or Democrat in the White House. Government was not getting any bigger. We're going through a period of time where government is going to get bigger. Will this be a blip post-pandemic, or does that become a secular shift? And is that, where the US would always have said before, we beat China through free markets, do we now say, well, we have to beat China through state intervention? These are things we might discuss at the end. I just quickly wanted, you talked about inflation, Sean, and let's talk about a couple of things that are more risk related before we wrap up this part of the session. One, what are the risks of this kind of spending power if it comes through, and what are the risks of spending it unwisely or not having the desired effect? And then secondly, whether the administration or officials in the US are worried about the exuberant levels of valuation in stock markets globally, given where we're going through at the moment, and whether that is a concern globally as we think about how we come through the pandemic. Sean, perhaps you start on this one, and then we'll let Jeff round it off.
Absolutely. On your first question, obviously the risk of inflation, of overspending right now, that is like a chief concern in the US. There's always been a concern about deficits. Magically, they come back, every 4 years, usually right around a presidential election, and they're coming back right now. So it's not too surprising that people are a little worried about this. When you think back to the 2008-09 crisis and the US government, spending a lot of money, trying to get ahead of trying to fix the situation, there was a worry afterwards that we're not getting prepared for that next crisis. And the US Congress ended up cutting taxes. You saw deficits expanding at a time of economic expansion, and lo and behold, the pandemic hit, and the US has now put themselves in quite a bit of a deficit hole. One of the other concerns, I think, with this deal is this expansion of government. And not just in the sense of, oh, we're spending this money now, it's that we're expanding what some would see as the entitlement system or policies that will be very difficult to roll back later. I think the flip side of that is, if I can speak on the other side of it, is some individuals in the US want to argue the US can do big policies, and the US must do these to show the world that it's possible. So if it's about, President Biden sometimes will comment on this idea that the US needs this Marshall Plan. This is the space race, and you've seen some of these writings in the White House fact sheets and documents coming out. And there is this idea of the US only needs to come together and evaluate where it's been. And it does cost some money now, but the economic benefits later on will be so great, it's worth it. You saw that in the president's speech when he commented about DARPA, the defense agency, when he said, like, DARPA was, at the end of the day, their research led to pretty amazing innovations, like I think he said the internet and satellite technology, other things like that. And I think the administration is fully comfortable with moving forward on this idea that they need to spend the money now. From the market's perspective, I think there is a concern on this for obvious reasons, and that inflation concern is first and foremost. But just to back up one sec, I don't think in the markets people think this deal is actually going to happen as is. We all realize there's going to be a lot of twists and turns. So I think it really is this sort of wait and see approach we have going forward. I'll pause now and let Jeffrey answer the question on asset valuations.
So I was just going to say that, again, you make a good comment about the speed in which they put together the American Rescue Plan, something that we're not used to seeing. I mean, obviously, again, without sounding glib, I mean, we weren't that far removed from the global financial crisis. Obviously, the administration's brought in a lot of veterans from the Obama administration. And again, what struck me, and I was also at Treasury during the Obama administration, working on the euro area crisis. So I was very steeped in a lot of that approach and sort of the lessons learned. And what it struck me is just how much they have tried to take the lessons learned, both good and bad, from that response. And I do think one of the things that we're worried about as the U.S. steps forward with a very substantial support for its economy, which will have positive global spillovers, is we want to see the other advanced economies, particularly in the large emerging markets, and particularly China, do the same. I think what we're worried about an asymmetric response where the U.S. is stepping up and stepping forward, and the rest of the world, particularly the parts of the world that can have the fiscal space to maintain support, step back, and then you get back into these sort of exacerbated external imbalances that then sort of makes a lot of the trade issues even more complicated. Doesn't help solve, again, what the keynote speaker talked about, the domestic politics around trade. And so again, very important for the countries that can afford to maintain support to continue to do so. I think that's something we're very worried about. And then I think just on inflation, again, I remember very distinctly the cries that hyperinflation were right around the corner, in 2010, and I guess every year since then, and it never happened. And I think the view of the administration is, I mean, obviously, fighting inflation is the job of the Federal Reserve, not the U.S. Treasury Department. I think the sense is that the Federal Reserve has the capacity and the tools and the wherewithal to manage those risks. And again, the bigger concern is doing too little and not too much.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, Sean. We will wrap that part of the fireside chat there and come back to you later for the Q&A session. I just want to say thank you to Karen for posting a question. It's a great one. We'll come back to that towards the end and put it to the whole panel. But for now, as we try to cram in as much as we can this morning, let's move on to our next fireside discussion, and that focuses on the fight to combat climate change. The Biden administration has made it clear that it doesn't just intend to catch up with the rest of the world following the Trump era. It will become again a world leader in this field. Many parts of Asia are, of course, among those that the Biden team will both want to catch up with and, we hope, partner with as well. So we are joined for this discussion by two eminent practitioners in this space. Lilian Macharia is Head of Portfolio Management at the Green Climate Fund. Lilian has more than 20 years experience designing, structuring and managing complex public and private financial sector investments, and is an alumnus of the African Development Bank. Rebecca Mikola-Wright has been the Executive Director of the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change since it was launched as a member organization in 2016. Rebecca has worked in climate change, sustainability and investment banking for over 20 years in Hong Kong, Europe and Australia. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they both have to say on this crucial topic. So let me kick off their discussion with the following question. Joe Biden has put the fight against climate change at the forefront of his administration. But will his actions speak as loud as his words? And what does the US return to the climate agenda mean for the global fight and APAC's leadership in this area? Lillian and Rebecca, over to you for the next 15 minutes.
Many thanks, Clive, for the introduction, and thanks. Good morning or good afternoon, colleagues. In response to your question, I think one is just to start by setting the context that the Biden administration has, of course, taken over leadership at a very critical time when the world is facing the global pandemic, very difficult, at a time where there's been a bit of, I would say, a lot of inequalities coming to the fore. So, and also if you look at in terms of a climate agenda, 2021 is, we have COP26 happening, which is 5 years after the Paris Agreement was signed. And it's a critical year where we take stock of what's happening, how much progress has been made in terms of realizing the commitments that were made. So the US leadership in this particular instance is particularly important. And also the fact that it's also the first time that we're also getting US re-engaging after it's, getting out of the US, the Paris Agreement. So definitely the Biden's prioritization of climate change and actions around it are of critical importance and are being taken very seriously. Now, if we're to say, to look at what that might mean, I think we're looking at it, I would look at it from maybe 3 perspectives, and I'll also then turn over to Rebecca to speak more on the Asian Pacific aspect. One is, of course, the re-engagement with the international community in terms of mobilizing and re-energizing action towards climate change. We realize that we are way behind the targets required and the actions required to realize the reduction in the global warming targets. So the US leadership in this regard is important. We note that already the government has undertaken to strengthen or to start developing its NDCs and its ambitious plan towards net zero pledges. And that's also, so to speak, set of a competition, which is healthy for us in terms of what the countries can do towards reducing their emissions. We've seen action from China. We've also seen some in the recent, I think, Bloomberg summit, where we also had some discussions with the Canada also coming on board and trying to increase its ambition. So that's very important. The US doubling of climate finance, commitment to doubling of climate finance by 2024 is of importance as well. So I think this is a good shot in the arm for the climate action efforts and also the efforts towards the tripling of adaptation finance. And the recently just concluded Leaders Summit on Climate Change is also, I think, one of the big signals that the US is really sending in terms of the willingness to sort of take up its space and lead the charge in terms of climate change. So I think from our perspective, we think this is very positive, and we think the US is, the return augurs well in terms of mobilizing the efforts, which are really badly needed right now. The second aspect is, of course, picking up from what the colleagues, the previous speakers have talked about, is with respect to the building back better. As countries now grapple with the post-COVID, pandemic challenges, especially in terms of economic front, the Biden administration has set up, I would say, a very ambitious and balanced approach towards ensuring that the rebuilding of the economy is on a sustainable path towards reducing emissions, but at the same time also puts into context the issues of economic justice, socio-environmental justice, and addressing inequalities as part of the core. And I think this is also part of what we see in, for example, the Paris Agreement, where there's a need to look at helping developing countries develop in a more sustainable manner, which is really addressing also the inequalities to make sure that then we don't end up continuing with the same trajectory of unsustainable development, but at the same time also helping them address the impacts of climate change, because unfortunately, as much as they may not be the highest emitters, they are the greatest victims or sufferers of the impacts of that. So the efforts being put in by the US government in this respect, we think are pretty important. And then, and I think also in terms of also how it's setting a domestic agenda we could say it's also signaling to what other countries could also do. And I think that also sets the tone for the other developing economies and developed economies to pick up the same, I would say, approach and trajectory. And then finally is, I think we see the US playing a critical role also in working very closely with, of course, the biggest emitters to really reduce the emissions. Because I think even if we contained the emissions that are coming in from the developing constituency, the developing countries, without containing the emissions from the biggest emitters, we will not meet the targets that we set for ourselves. So the action of the US government in this respect is particularly, I think, important. And from our perspective, we think watching that space and seeing what US does in this respect is critical, and we see positive signs. But as you say, it's early days. It also, the administration also has to navigate also the domestic and multilateral aspects, as you say, working with China and seeing how it's able to collaborate with the different countries to get to deliver this. But maybe now to speak to the implications for Asian, the Asia Pacific region. Maybe I'll ask Rebecca, how do you see the administration, leadership impacting, or rather, the new administration affecting APAC's leadership in this area?
Thanks, Lillian, and thanks, Clive. Great to be speaking here with you all today. So when it comes to the US's new position on climate, it's a race to the top on climate, and that's the best type of competition we can have. And I think we've heard that from a few of the speakers we've had today, and Lillian also. It's about, they have to demonstrate they're making up for lost time. And actions, I think, are already speaking louder than their words. The ambition that they're signalling is hugely significant, but it's about the implementation that has to follow very quickly in this next decade till 2030, if we have any chance of reaching, the net zero that we need to by 2050. And so, their activities, and as Jeffrey referred to earlier, we've heard about, the climate is central to sort of every government department, every decision they make, including Treasury. They're already undertaking stress testing of the financial system, looking at climate risk disclosures, carbon border tax adjustments, in addition to obviously the spending and so on that's already happening. But the impacts to the APAC region, obviously, apart from those signals and what's happening on the US side, is how this flows through with the global coordination that's happening with central banks and regulators, for example, through the Network for Greening the Financial System, which, for example, last year released climate scenarios that governments in Asia, like China and Japan and others, are already using to stress test their financial systems. So having the US come to that table and show that they're on board with this as well and catch up to where the others are already in the region, is really significant and serves to further accelerate the momentum that we have seen. Obviously, we saw recently John Kerry coming to the region and looking to get greater granularity around the commitments and earlier commitments from China, Japan, and Korea, which builds on that leadership that already came out last year. And arguably, I think the surprise announcement from China on their before 2060 net zero pledge arguably was the part of that race to the top, China trying to get out in front of the US ahead of Biden potentially coming in with the next administration. So that's really significant, and you can see the US coming back up and strengthening those agreements from within Asia, but obviously also globally as well through his climate leadership summit last year. So I think, the benefits to the geopolitics, obviously, between US and China is clearly hugely significant on climate. Their joint statements on climate, very significant, with China referring to it as a climate emergency for the very first time, underpins this level of understanding that there are no jobs on a dead planet. And I think global governments, see this quite clearly, but it's about the implementation, and it has to happen now. And that's what the US is really pushing for, this immediate implementation. What are the updated nationally determined contributions that need to be put on the table ahead of the COP this year? So really, reinforcing the significance of this year and the commitments that need to come through. And also in the markets that haven't yet acted, like where I am in Australia at the moment, sort of really forcing that position and forcing that change from governments who may have been more reluctant and in more difficult positions in sort of their quite emissions intensive economies to force that shift sort of yet again. And that impact we're seeing is also immediate. But moving on to sort of how investors, how this is impacting investors and corporates in the region. I mean, I think, the increasing awareness of the climate impacts of the region, the costs of that impacts, we're seeing that happen with greater regularity from the extreme weather events we're experiencing all the time. But as AIGCC highlighted in a recent report, in the energy sector alone, there's a $37 trillion US opportunity to transition that sector to net zero, and it's not unaffordable. It's actually around 2% of GDP, sort of less than some other current projections. And so the governments have clearly recognised this and are now, they've set their 2050 sort of targets, and now we're starting to see these policies come through. Korea is a great example. They were the first Asian nation to set out a Green New Deal plan, and they already backed that up last year with enabling policies that we've already seen Green New Deal funds established at the back of that. That's clearly signalling that they want to attract this capital to help them transition. And that's ultimately what it's about, that link between obviously the global investor community and where that private capital goes. Governments can't afford to fund the climate, addressing the climate crisis on their own. They simply don't have enough in their budgets. So that's where they need to address this public-private partnerships and how they can attract more capital. But they must create these enabling policies in order to do that. So we're starting to see that flow through in the region. And again, that sort of leadership that's already come from the region is just being underpinned. And I think the US, the very specific examples they're putting through Treasury and the different departments is showing how that can be done and how that sort of needs to flow through. So I think, as we know that there are already, policy developments in place in Asia, I think that will further accelerate and put pressure to kind of to match, what's the equivalent they're doing in their local markets. I mean, on the corporate side in the region, we're seeing, an increasing number of net zero commitments, net zero by 2050, and how the corporate sector is planning to address this. And this has started to flow through in Asia, but there's a very big push and a number of very significant commitments from obviously the large tech companies, all the way through to auto companies in the US. And so US corporate leadership has also stepped up significantly, again, matching that in other markets that we've already seen from the EU. And again, that flow through to the region and that impact on global supply chains is hugely significant. But I might just, the other sort of part that we're seeing and sort of one of the trends, encouraging trends that we're seeing in the region is, there is a lot of new activity. We saw a record number of new ESG funds being launched last year in 2020. And BlackRock, for example, alone reported a 50% increase in their climate flows into their funds in 2020. And in a recent report survey of our members, about 70% of investors surveyed said they're launching new funds by 2022. So I wanted to ask Lillian, from your perspective at the GCF, this is an exciting space. We're seeing all these new funds, all these new fund flows. So how is the GCF, how do you see this activity? Is this competition for you? How does the GCF see working with these new investment vehicles that are being created, which we obviously need more of, but how do you make sense of this very dynamic and changing environment?
Right, thanks, Rebecca. I think we very much welcome as many players as we can into the space. We don't see it as competition because what we have in terms of resources vis-a-vis the demand and what is required is, it's very, very little. So as many players as we can get on board, we are very happy to have. Just to give you, just some figures, it's estimated that between now and 2030, we need at least $3 trillion. Therefore, there's a value of about, climate opportunities of about $3 trillion available. But right now, we are looking at about $14 trillion invested in negative yielding, debt in OECD countries. And the question is, why is it, why aren't those resources flowing from those, negative yielding contexts to areas where they need? So I think if we can get more people, more players into that space, we are definitely welcoming that. And for us, what we're looking at is probably looking at how we can complement each other with players. Firstly, GCF is a partnership organization. We work through accredited entities, and they work, and what we try and do is look for partners who have an ability to mobilize others and catalyze and identify opportunities on the ground and help us to be able to identify technologies, approaches, and scale them up widely. And for that to happen, as you indicated, governments are constrained in terms of their fiscal balance sheets because of the debt and the challenges we currently have. So the private sector participation is absolutely necessary. And to the extent that we can get more players coming into that space to fill in those gaps, that's something that we're looking very forward to doing. But for GCF, what we're trying to do is trying to de-risk investments, because right now, even as we talk about investment flows, they go to the more established and more secure destinations. Even as we talk about flows towards developing countries, it's more to the middle income, the most safe and more established sectors. And there's a huge gap in terms of areas where there's the most vulnerable countries that require investment are perceived high risk. And they have also quite a number of challenges in terms of attracting investors. So GCF is working with different entities and partners to de-risk investments using either risk capital guarantees, issuing guarantees for debts, so that we attract more investors into some of those areas. And that also includes areas like adaptation. Would like to start moving into seeing that sector also getting a lot more investment than we've been seeing a lot on mitigation, which is a bit more fairly established. But that means we have to be willing to take a bit more of the risk, but then attract other partners to come in and help us ramp up the investment in that area until we get the hang of it, and then we can scale that up. So our role right now is to help de-risk, promote technologies and approaches that can be scaled over wide and work with partners in that respect. I think I'll stop here. I see Clive has come on, so we're happy to take questions.
Lillian and Rebecca, thank you. Unfortunately, 15 minutes goes incredibly fast. I certainly noticed in our pre-panel discussion that climate change was something that the whole panel wanted to talk about. So we'll save up a couple of questions for the Q&A at the end, if that's okay with you, but we don't want to run too far behind. But certainly you framed some really interesting discussion points there. And this is a conversation that is certainly going to continue for some time. But in the interest of time, let's move on to our Fireside Chat 3 after thanking again Lillian and Rebecca. And the US and Chinese administrations seem to have some things in common on technology, at least. They're trying to rein in the power of tech companies at home, but at the same time, they're throwing suspicion on foreign providers, especially from their respective countries. Do we face a new Cold War in technology? And what does it all mean for growing non-Chinese Asia tech and fintech companies? These are, of course, important, complex, and often sensitive issues. What's not in doubt is the continued impact technology is having on Asia as a region, that governments and private sector are learning all the time on how best to work together in this space, and that some of the decisions in this area made in Washington, DC will have a global impact. So for this, our final Fireside Chat of the morning, we are delighted to be joined by two people with a great perspective on all of these issues. Ilaria Chan is the Group Advisor on Tech and Social Impact for Grab, Southeast Asia's fast-growing fintech, where she focuses on advancing diplomacy, thought leadership, and social impact reach. Before taking on this role, she was a corporate finance executive who helped drive Grab's landmark $5 billion Series H fundraising. Douglas Arner is the Kerry Holdings Professor in Law at the University of Hong Kong. He's also Director of the Faculty's Master of Laws in Compliance and Regulation, and Project Coordinator of a major 5-year research scheme entitled Enhancing Hong Kong's Future as a Leading International Financial Centre. He's a member of the Hong Kong Financial Services Development Council, and he's also, I should say, OMFIF's most valuable player this week, having taken part in our 2-day Digital Monetary Institute Symposium with over 2,500 attendees, which finished all of 6 hours ago. OMFIF never sleeps, but for now, let me pose to Douglas first and then Ilaria the following question to kick things off. If we look at the state of technology in Asia today, how has the response to COVID-19 accelerated digital finance in the region? Douglas, over to you.
Thanks for that, Clive. And yeah, I think this focus on digital finance is really important, not least because if we look at one of the impacts of COVID, we've probably seen in the past year what we would have anticipated in 3 or 5 years of developments in digital finance. And I think we can look at this narrowly, but we're also beginning to look at it a bit more broadly. In other words, this crisis has not been like 2008. This has not so far been a financial crisis. And instead, digital finance has played a very important role in mitigating the crisis all over the world. The second, as we begin to think forward, is what can we do to strengthen digital finance so that we can use it to prevent crises, or when crises do happen, to strengthen the resilience of the system. And focusing on our last topic, also, how can we build digital financial infrastructure that puts us in a stronger position for broader sustainable development? And I think if we look at the big picture impact of COVID on digital finance across Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, and really globally, we can focus in on 4 different aspects. The first has been electronic payment. And I think the lockdowns, the experience has shown just how important electronic payment is. And this is something that we've seen from the standpoint of the United States, just how ineffective mailing checks to people without bank accounts can be, and the necessity of having electronic payment systems that are able pretty much everywhere to reach an entire population. And this is something where we've seen some pretty dramatic developments across Asia. And I think that we're seeing some big picture discussions as we think about looking forward in terms of designing systems. And you mentioned the Digital Monetary Institute's discussions over the past couple of days. One aspect of that big picture is around questions of payment systems design. How can we build better payment systems through central bank digital currencies or technologies through, say, the G20 roadmap process? The second has been as a result of non-face-to-face interactions. And this has driven a process of financial institutions building technology to basically be able to deal with their customers, but also to deal with their staff and to deal with their regulators. And from the standpoint of regulators, central banks and regulators having to deal with one another, both their own staff, but also other agencies in their own country and around the world, online. This is the idea of RegTech or SoupTech, using technology for regulatory and supervisory purposes. And COVID has driven that forward pretty much incredibly in the past year. And I think this is something where regulators and supervisors, as well as the financial services industry all over the world, are looking at how to use technology to build better regulatory systems. The third, which is a specific example of this, is what we've seen in market integrity around money laundering, around terrorist financing, and a realization, I think, signposted just over a year ago by the FATF, that often digital onboarding systems are actually better than paper-based onboarding systems. And in particular, sovereign digital identity systems can be an important framework of underpinning market integrity as well as access. And we're beginning to see real efforts in the US and elsewhere about thinking about how can we redesign AML systems to make them work better. And one of the best examples is the new database of beneficial ownership that has just been created in the United States. That is a centralized structure as opposed to a decentralized structure on the financial institution standpoint. And I think going forward, this is going to be one of the biggest areas where we have the opportunity to use COVID experiences to build better systems. The fourth is really around data, that all of this digitization has driven concentrations of data. And we can see this from a number of different angles, which I think going forward are hugely important. The first is the risk standpoint. In other words, the more you concentrate data, the more cybersecurity risks you can see. And we're beginning to see cybersecurity not just as a financial risk, a crime risk, a financial stability risk, but also as a national security risk. And so this is something where we're seeing focuses everywhere around the world. This is also from the standpoint of tech infrastructure, the internet, mobile phone companies, cloud-based systems, all of these structures where we've become far more reliant in the last year. And how do we balance the great benefits we're seeing with some of the risks? And I think going forward, as Clive mentioned, this big picture question of how do we go about getting the benefits of data aggregations without necessarily having those controlled in individual walled gardens. And we're seeing very different approaches developing across major economies. In the EU around data protection, GDPR. In China, looking at perhaps separating data out into a new entity from their data majors. And the US, I think, still working through this. And I think if we're thinking forward, this issue of how countries go about maximizing the benefits of data while minimizing the risks is going to be central to thinking about the core role that technology is already playing in finance, but is going to play in wider sustainable development going forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Douglas. For us, obviously, I'm representing a operating tech company in Southeast Asia. Just a little bit of background is Grab is currently a regional super app. So we operate in 8 countries in Southeast Asia. So we started off as a ride-hailing company, then moved on to now have delivery services and fintech services and even telemedicine in Indonesia. And I really learned so much from all the speakers today. And I think one thing that I really take away is really the word partnership, because in many ways too, when we talk about regulation, I mean, what is it to regulate, right? Regulate means you're trying to control and maintain the speed of something so it operates properly. And in many ways, I feel like regulations are there to also protect the vulnerable in society that normally cannot protect themselves. And we couldn't agree more, which is how Grab was founded 9 years ago by our 2 co-founders as they took a class at Harvard Business School called Business at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And now we're looking at the pandemic and all the changes in the pandemic, and digital finance is really at the core of everything we do. And I think that if we zoom out a little bit, looking at our region currently, right, Southeast Asia has around 670 million people. That's double the USA. And we have higher GDP growth than China. Almost 3/5 of the population is under 30 years old, and around 60% of the people are underbanked. So we see that the opportunities are enormous, but there are also severe imbalances in certain places, and sometimes a missing middle where a lot of people are still invisible. So in many ways, what we do and what we see is very focused on that, focusing on looking at the imbalance in skills, focusing on how we can bring digital literacy and access to economic opportunities to the mass population, which is just so key. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, since everything has been turned upside down, we've had someone like a testing inspector in the aerospace industry who also drives a Grab car part-time. They got retrained and somehow later on got a job as a software engineer. Now that is a result of a private partnership between Grab and Microsoft, where we realized how important it is to support gig workers and to support people out there who need access to digital and financial literacy. And so then we created these digital literacy programs to empower them so that they can have access to free learning modules. We have it as Grab Academy in the Grab Partner app. And so people can have access to these. There's another example of during the pandemic, a lot of food business people and grocery delivery people, they are disrupted if they operate in a physical space. We had a 60-year-old lady in North Sumatra who essentially thought, what am I going to do? I've been selling fruits on this stand for 30 years. And we were able to offer her a solution by onboarding her as a merchant on our app, so that the delivery portion and finding customers and going online portion and even the e-wallet portion is being taken care of. We handhold her to learn how to use the system, and she has to just take care with her produce and her bread and butter. And in many ways, you know, when we look at the digital finance sector too, many governments, we've just been so delighted to be able to partner with them, such as the Malaysian government, the Malaysian Ministry of Finance. They were distributing about 180 million US dollars as part of their economic recovery plan. And we were just honored that they used GrabPay as their non-government linked wallet partner. So the disbursement is one thing. And the beauty of that type of disbursement, and I think Douglas, in your excellent paper written about digital finance, you mentioned about the speed and traceability of digital finance and how that can really benefit the ecosystem. Well, for us, not only we were able to have these qualities, but we also saw that these subsidies from the government that were dispersed to the people ended up being spent at local merchants. They're used to buy food, they're used to buy more groceries, more essentials, and the multiplier effect was very strong, and we were able to witness that. And so these are some of the beauty, I think, that mobile money and these payment infrastructures, the convenience and the transparency that they're able to bring, that I think is greatly catapulted by the pandemic. And the key is we have to be, like you said, Douglas, just careful about the risk. And also, most importantly, have the interests of the mass population at heart as we develop products from a private company standpoint, as government develop policies, and we partner together in a public-private partnership to ensure that the people are taken care of that are usually being overlooked. So Douglas, let me ask you, because you really are the academic expert in area of financial regulation and the intersection of law, of tech, and of finance. How do you see tech regulation? What would you think would be a really great way to see a few regulations out there to bring about the most prosperous and ideal outcome for the current landscape?
Thanks for this. And yeah, Laurie, I think your analysis really highlights exactly the way that companies such as yours have played a very important role in the context of the crisis, but also the way in which digital finance really supports inequality and development over time. And I think COVID has really given an opportunity to look into some of the things that, particularly on the government side, that you can do in basically building better frameworks for digital finance to not only deal with future existential sustainability crises, whatever they may be, but also to support sustainable development more positively. And I think the key pieces that we're seeing is really around sovereign digital identity frameworks. This is something that India's experience has been tremendously powerful, but we're seeing particularly an increasing range of countries around the region and around the world looking at this. And it's something that is incredibly empowering from the standpoint of easing access of individuals, particularly excluded individuals for whatever reason, to the formal financial system, the formal economy. So sovereign digital identity systems, I think, is fundamental. The second, as we've already talked about, is electronic payments. But electronic payments, they really need to be interoperable. In other words, someone needs to be able to make payments across multiple platforms to get them to different places in the economy. And this is something that China, with its new central bank digital currency, is trying to address what were formerly walled gardens between Alipay and Tencent by essentially providing a bridge that enables interoperability to break down those walled gardens. And I think this is where we're seeing a tremendous amount of effort in this idea of partnership, collaboration between governments and the private sector in trying to build better payment systems. The third is really around account access. If everybody in a country has access to a bank account or a mobile money account, it makes it easier to get resources in a crisis to them. And this combination of infrastructure is tremendously powerful from the standpoint of delivery of any sort of government service. But I think your point is hugely important, that what it also does is it dramatically reduces the cost of customer acquisition, which enables private companies to come in and innovate with new business models, new products, new approaches. And when we talk about the potential of the next billion, that's really what we're talking about. And so from the standpoint of what you all are doing, how does this sort of compare to your experience?
Well, I mean, every day it's all changing. But I do think the most important part of standing where we were is to understand the importance of empowering the SMEs and the merchants, because in an app like us, right? Without them, there is no app. So for us, their flourishing, not just surviving, is the key objective for us. And so that's why, for example, financial inclusion is a huge objective of ours, because many of these gig workers, right, delivery partners, driver partners, they can work forever, for 20, 30 years, and they don't save any money. And in that region, in many developing nations, loan sharks do prey on them, and they end up losing all their savings, and they're stuck in a cash economy. And what we want to do for our fintech portion of the business, by extending microloans, by bringing them into the digital world, establish an e-wallet for them, and giving them, most importantly, digital and financial literacy to know about all this, is so that they can start earning, tracking, creating credit history, able to get loans, able to upgrade their livelihoods. And then when the nation prospers, all our businesses prosper. And I believe that the government's objectives are very much aligned with us as well. So I definitely think empowering the masses, especially in areas like financial inclusion, is just so important.
I want to take this back to essentially the U.S. context. And if we look at some of these areas, if we look at U.S. strategy, it's definitely a big focus is going to be on technology, on research and development. But from the standpoint of digital finance, this is an area where we've probably seen a bit fewer initiatives than some of the other areas that we've talked about today. But I would say that there are some big developments that have changed. The first is an increasing discussion around US payment systems and the role of a potential central bank digital currency, a digital dollar, but also regulatory approaches to digital assets, new forms of finance more broadly. The second, as I mentioned already, is this issue around AML, and I think an increasing openness to thinking about how we can design systems that are not only more efficient from the standpoint of compliance, but actually are a lot more effective at achieving our regulatory objectives of preventing criminal and terrorist use of the financial system. But I think the big one going forward, where everyone is struggling with this and is going to be struggling for some time, is around the balance of data. How do you maximize the benefits but minimize the risks?
I agree with you. Clive, I see you on. We'll probably wrap with that note on our part. Thank you
both so much. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Ilaria. That's so much we could talk about tech over, and hopefully in future sessions we'll be able to do the same. I was talking the other day to the Asia operations of one of the big global fintechs, and one of the things that they're most concerned about, of course, was piecemeal regulation. The regulation comes in country by country or by region, and whether that's inevitable, or whether there is some way to think about regional or even global regulation around fintech, around technology, that allows the benefits to keep flowing, but also gives the safety that any new industry needs. And I suppose that comes back to sort of like the group, to sort of round this off with a group Q&A discussion. And we were talking earlier about climate change, and it felt that the world is sort of still waiting for the US to take the lead on the global fight against climate change. And does that speak, and maybe, jump in whoever wants to here, does that speak to the fact that, for all of Asia's growth and for all that we talk about China, that still America is effectively the global leader, and it's still the reference point? And on climate change, is that a good thing? Maybe Rebecca and Lillian can start us off on that, as they're the experts on climate change. Then please do jump in, whoever wants to.
Hi, Clive. Thank you. Yes and no. I think, no, I don't think everybody's waiting for the US. And I think what we saw when the US did pull out of the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, that it didn't fall apart, and it actually increased the resolve of groups like the European Union, China, and other countries, and they came together. And so I think that was, there was a moment where we were all worried, and so I think that, yeah, that's an answer, no answer there, but there's no doubt that obviously having the US at the table is hugely significant and absolutely necessary. So, and we're seeing how that acceleration is coming through, and that will enable greater global collaboration. And what are the, the global regulations and standards that are needed, that we really need to see coming through, in different markets, whether it's, carbon taxes or taxonomies, mandatory disclosure. So I think they're sort of some of the big areas that will now be, greatly helped by having the US at the table, and those conversations will be able to happen faster, and then the implementation will be able to flow through.
Yeah, I think I would just also absolutely want to add on to what Rebecca has said. It's a yes and no, but I would think largely I would say having the US also, it still has significant influence globally. So having it round the table is definitely a plus. and that the fact that then, you have more bringing back the multilateralism, we need global action, collective action. So having a key player not being part of that has been, a bit of a bummer, if we put it that way, but having them back on the fold and taking that leadership role together with the other parties on the table, around the table, is definitely very, very welcome. And in that respect, then would still say yes, they're very helpful in that respect. But as you can also, as Rebecca has also said, the other countries also, have also been able to hold up, even in the absence of the US. But having them round the table, of course, just really helps galvanize the action that is required to move us towards the target of reducing the climate impact around globally. Thank you.
Any other of our panelists want to jump in on this one?
I'm just going to say real quick that I think this is an area where, like trade that Mohammed Munir highlighted, that we're seeing a real sort of multipolarity between our sort of major economies, and things do move ahead if one or another are not necessarily in the process. And I think we're likely to see more of that, situations where it may be 2 as opposed to 3 if we're talking US, EU, China, in a variety of contexts, moving on different things. And I think the EU had moved more quickly in the climate change context, but I think climate is one where obviously it's a common existential threat to everyone, and so there's a benefit as a public good to cooperation. But also, if we think about this dynamic of potentially fragmented approaches to financial regulation, real risks in having different approaches in major economies to actually directing resources in the right way.
Well, let's take a question from Jean-Remy. Thanks, Jean-Remy, for this question. He worries that rather than cooperation, it might go the other way. He says, is there not a risk that climate policies might be used as a non-tariff barrier for trade? Jeffrey, would you mind having a go at that one?
Well, I think we are worried about non-tariff barriers on a lot of issues. In fact, the discussion about digital finance, reminded me, we've been very focused on sort of the openness and data flows cross-border, the use of data localization laws to address, security privacy concerns, something that we're very focused, particularly in Southeast Asia. We've run into a lot of those issues. In terms of climate policies, I guess these, there's a concern with the carbon border adjustment policies that have been proposed. I think, though, for the United States, though, I think what we are bringing to the table, or one of the things that we can bring to the table, is we're home to the largest and deepest capital markets in the world. And I think there is a huge recognition that public balance sheets alone can't accomplish what we need on climate for the investments. And I think, and this is something that I focused in a lot on my previous job, is how we can connect particularly these institutional pools of capital to the investment needs, particularly in emerging markets. It's less of an issue in developed markets, but in emerging markets, including in Southeast Asia, when it comes to green infrastructure, even green agriculture, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of work to be done on carbon credit markets in Southeast Asia. And I think that's a big reason why Secretary Yellen decided to step up and co-chair the Sustainable Finance Working Group in the G20, because I do think we bring, even if you feel like we've been absent for the last 4 years, there's been a lot of developments in our sort of private sector and our capital markets, and I think that is something that we bring to the table that China does not bring. And maybe even arguably, a European Union, which tends again to have a more regulatory sort of based approach to a lot of these issues. I think what the U.S. brings, and I think would be welcome, particularly in Southeast Asia and Asia, is one that combines kind of a government approach, but one also sort of rooted in sort of the markets and how we can sort of tap market mechanisms.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks. And just we are running out of time fast here, so just come to a final question to the group, and this is from Karen. Thank you, Karen, for your question. And she says, in his address to Congress on Wednesday, President Biden cast the U.S.-China relationship as a litmus test of the merits of democracy versus autocracy. And I wonder whether people think that the group think that framing is it still a valid and helpful one, given we've talked a lot about the need for cooperation as we try to build back better on a global basis? Sean, maybe you can kick us off on this one.
Yeah, I think the perspective in the U.S. has been this, was the U.S. able to manage through the last few months? It got obviously extremely bad at the height of the pandemic here in the U.S. And it's framed, again, as this positioning of the U.S. versus China, and this idea that the U.S. is not flexible and innovative enough. So I think it wasn't surprising when I heard that line, and having watched this administration frame other discussions around this idea of this is a test for democracy. Can the U.S. be able to handle this? Can the U.S. Find that innovative spot? This talk about American decline has been something we've seen in the U.S. since the last recession in 2008, and it's something that's I think lingered a bit here in the United States. I hear that from clients quite a bit around the world as well. So I wasn't generally surprised when I heard that line. In fact, that's something I almost expected President Biden to say.
Thanks, Sean. Anybody else got an opinion for this one? Munir, you had some interesting thoughts at the start. I wonder whether you would like to sort of like close for us here.
Well, thank you. I think quite obviously, anyone watching what's been happening in this world in the past decade would see like democracy in retreat, democracy under attack. And it was demonstrated, of course, dramatized by the insurrection and of course, the Brexit debates that took place. And the fact that the U.S. government was not functioning properly, and the executive was having powers far in excess of the democratic system, which the U.S. is supposed to represent through Donald Trump, for example. So inevitably, there were eyes cast on China, which organized things better, had better effect. The country was better organized. And countries like in Southeast Asia, who are more predisposed to control over freedom, obviously were attracted to the outcomes of better control. Good, usually, but sometimes also bad, as you well know. And so with this predisposition, the Americans in this marketplace of world sort of governing systems, America's looking a little sort of smashed up, and China was looking good. And therefore, a reassertion, and in my personal view, it is necessary to do so as to ensure that we do not slip into autocratic or dictatorial tendencies. I worry about, contact tracing, in the COVID environment. I have said, this obviously attracts a lot of people for wrong reasons, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia. and in China perhaps. So the US has got to actually show that it is a democracy, but a democracy that works. And that's a test that it has to pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir, and thank you to all of the panel. It's been a fantastic hour and a half of discussions. I think to sort of inject a note of caution at the end, of course, we all know that in the end, whether Biden stands for a second term or not, the next president will be decided more about what's happening in US domestic arena than it will be what America's relationship with the world is per se. It's the economy stupid, as they said, and that still applies. But hopefully the US's engagement will lead to the sort of economic improvement that will lead to its continuous engagement going forward, no matter who the president is. I think on climate change, it's very interesting. The environmental side of the programs that Biden is proposing will hopefully lead a fight against climate change to be an absolute hands-down vote winner at the next US election, which it maybe hasn't been so far. And maybe that will lead to more concrete and long-term improvements in that area. For now, a thank you to all of our panelists, a thank you to everybody who has listened in and stayed with us. And also a thank you to Sean and his colleagues at Barclays for helping us put today together. There will be more in this series coming up, but for now, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy your weekend, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thanks very much.